There is a church in England that exists because a king wanted out of his marriage. Every brick of it, every prayer spoken inside it, every archbishop who ever wore its robes, all of it traces back to one man who couldn't get Rome to say yes. That church was built on the bones of a broken marriage. And then, 4 centuries later, that same church looked at a young princess in love with a decorated war hero and told her the answer was no, because the man she loved had been married before. That isn't irony as a footnote. That is the whole story. The Church of England was founded as a machine for one man's annulment, and the same institution that freed a king to remarry became the wall that kept a princess from doing the same thing. The difference between them was never really about God. It was about who was holding a crown when they asked the question, and who wasn't. To understand what happened to Princess Margaret, you have to go back to 1527, to a king who had a problem Rome wouldn't solve for him. Henry VIII had been married to Catherine of Aragon for 18 years. She was 7 years his senior, a Spanish princess, deeply devout, and by the standards of any dynastic marriage of the era, she had been a good wife. They had ridden together at hunts and feasts. The royal couple had been, for a time, genuinely close. But Catherine had given him one surviving child, a daughter, Mary, and a sequence of infant deaths and miscarriages that Henry had come to read as a theological verdict. Leviticus 20:21 forbids a man from marrying his brother's widow. Catherine had previously been married to Henry's older brother Arthur, who died in 1502. Henry had convinced himself, or allowed himself to be convinced, that God's punishment for a sinful union was the absence of a son. He was also infatuated with Anne Boleyn, a sharp, politically astute woman who had watched her sister become a royal mistress and discarded the template. Anne wanted all or nothing from the king. She would be his lawful queen or nothing at all. Henry wanted her. He needed a male heir. He had a theological argument ready-made. He asked Rome to declare the Catherine marriage invalid from the start. Pope Clement VII refused. The reasons were layered. Doctrinally, a marriage couldn't simply be unmade because a canonical impediment had allegedly been present. Pope Julius II had already granted a dispensation allowing the marriage in the first place, and overturning one pope's ruling wasn't something another pope did lightly. Politically, the situation was worse. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe, whose troops had sacked Rome in 1527 and left the papacy in the uncomfortable position of dependent client. Clement was caught between the theology of marital indissolubility, his need to avoid contradicting Julius II, and his political survival under imperial pressure. He stalled. He hedged. He sent legates to England. He convened proceedings. He found reasons to delay. For 6 years, Henry waited for an answer that wasn't coming. So, Henry found a different mechanism. In early 1533, Parliament passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals, drafted by Thomas Cromwell, which cut off the papal courts from any jurisdiction over English matrimonial cases. England was declared an empire, a sovereign domain with final legal authority over its own affairs. The move was radical. It didn't dissolve the marriage, it dissolved the Pope's right to have anything to say about it. Henry's new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, consecrated on 30 March 1533, opened court proceedings 6 weeks later. On 23 May 1533, at Dunstable Priory in Bedfordshire, with Catherine declared contumacious for refusing to appear, Cranmer's court pronounced Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void, not dissolved, but declared never to have been valid. 5 days later, the same court declared his marriage to Anne Boleyn valid. Anne was crowned Queen of England on 1 June 1533. She was already pregnant. The child would turn out to be a daughter, the future Elizabeth I. The formal constitutional codification came more than a year after that. In November 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, recognizing Henry as the only supreme head in earth of the Church of England, called Anglicana Ecclesia. The document was careful in its phrasing. Parliament wasn't granting Henry this status, it was acknowledging what it said already existed. The Church had been functionally born from the annulment. The Act of Supremacy was the birth certificate. This distinction matters for the argument the script is making. Henry didn't get a divorce in the modern sense. He got an annulment, a legal and theological finding that the marriage to Catherine had never been validly contracted in the first place. His argument was that Pope Julius II's dispensation had been invalid, that the Levitical prohibition couldn't be overridden by any human authority, and therefore that he had always been, in the eyes of God, a free man. Rome called it a pretext. Henry called it a legal finding and appointed the judge himself. The Church of England was the apparatus he built to deliver that finding. What grew from it, the theological development, the English Reformation, the genuine religious transformation that followed across decades, is real and consequential and belongs to a different story. But its founding act, the precipitating rupture, was a marriage dispute that the Universal Church had refused to resolve in Henry's favor. He built a new church that would. Keep that in mind. The rest of this story depends on it. The rule the Church of England developed about remarriage after divorce was grounded in something real. In the Gospels, Matthew chapters 5 and 19, Mark chapter 10, Christ speaks of marriage as a lifelong covenant. The husband and wife become one flesh. What God has joined, let no man put asunder. The Western Church had taken this seriously for centuries, and so did the Church of England. In 1930, the Lambeth Conference, which gathers Anglican bishops from across the world, passed a resolution recommending against solemnizing the marriage of anyone whose former partner was still living. In 1938, the Convocations of Canterbury and York put it in explicit language that would remain the operative rule for the next 64 years. The text stated that both divorce itself and remarriage after divorce during the lifetime of a former partner always involve a departure from the true principle of marriage, and that the Church shouldn't allow the use of the marriage service in the case of anyone who has a former partner still living. The Convocations reinforced the position again in 1957. The prohibition wasn't a single numbered canon you could look up. It rested on convocation resolutions, episcopal statements, and consistent institutional practice. But the effect was unambiguous. While a former spouse still breathed, the Church of England wouldn't stand at the altar for a second marriage. Now, layer in what the English Reformation had built. Elizabeth I's Act of Supremacy in 1559 gave the monarch the title Supreme Governor of the Church of England, the formulation used by every sovereign since, and the title that applies to Queen Elizabeth II in the 1950s we're concerned with. The monarch is simultaneously the head of state and the constitutional head of the established church. The same person sits on the throne and holds the governorship of the institution that sets the doctrine. And that arrangement created a trap, elegant in its construction, brutal in its application, that would fire twice on the same family within 20 years. If the Church's teaching holds that remarriage while a former spouse lives is a departure from true Christian marriage, and if the monarch is the supreme governor of that church, then the Church's rule and the Crown's person can't be separated. A monarch who married a divorcee, or a senior royal who married a divorced person, wouldn't merely be breaking a social convention. They would be placing the Supreme Governor in open contradiction with the institution the Supreme Governor symbolically heads. The Church can't have its living emblem doing the thing its doctrine prohibits. That is the trap. In December 1936, it caught Edward VIII. Edward had been king since 20 January 1936, succeeding George V. He was 41 years old, popular with the public in a particular modern way, accessible, informal, someone who had visited depressed mining villages in Wales and said that something must be done. He had been Prince of Wales for 26 years. He was also, by the time he took the throne, deeply committed to an American woman named Wallis Warfield Simpson, who had been married twice before him. Her first marriage had been to Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., a U.S. Navy aviator. That marriage ended in divorce on 10 December 1927. She had remarried Ernest Aldrich Simpson on 21 July 1928 at Chelsea Register Office in London. By the summer of 1936, that second marriage was failing too. Wallis filed for divorce from Ernest in July 1936. A decree nisi, a provisional divorce order, was granted on 27 October 1936. The decree absolute, making the divorce final, wouldn't come until May 1937. At the moment the constitutional crisis reached its peak, Wallis Simpson's second divorce was still pending. She had 2 living former husbands. The Church of England didn't fully recognize her first American divorce as valid under English law, potentially treating her second marriage as bigamous, which would have made any marriage to Edward III in a chain of questionable validity. Archbishop of Canterbury Cosmo Gordon Lang held that the king, as head of the Church of England, simply couldn't marry a divorcee. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin told Edward plainly that the British public wouldn't accept a twice-divorced American woman as queen. The Dominion governments, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, concurred. The political and ecclesiastical objections arrived simultaneously from every direction. The crisis came to a head in early December 1936. The British press, which had maintained a remarkable silence on the matter, broke it when Alfred Blunt, the Bishop of Bradford, made an address to his diocesan conference that was interpreted as a public allusion to the crisis. By 3 December, it was front-page news. Wallis left England for the south of France to escape press attention. At a tearful departure, Edward told her, "I shall never give you up." He meant it. He had already told Baldwin, "I intend to marry Mrs. Simpson as soon as she is free to do so. If the government opposed the marriage, as the Prime Minister had given me reason to believe it would, then I was prepared to go." On 10 December 1936, at Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park, his private residence, a castellated fantasy house he had made his own, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. His 3 brothers witnessed it, including the Duke of York, Albert, who would become George VI. The following day, Parliament passed the His Majesty's Declaration of Abdication Act. That evening, from Windsor Castle, Edward made his radio broadcast to the nation. "I have found it impossible," he said, "to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love." It was heard by millions. Then Edward left England. Wallis's second divorce became final in May 1937. He married her on 3 June 1937 at Château des Condés in the Loire Valley, in a room decorated with white peonies and pink larkspur. He was 77 when he died in Paris in May 1972. He and Wallis were married for 35 years. He never returned to constitutional power. He never reclaimed the throne. He spent the rest of his life as the Duke of Windsor, exiled from the institution he had led and from the family he had rearranged by leaving. What matters for understanding what happened to Margaret is the nature of that trade. Edward had something to put on the table. The crown was his to surrender. He could look at the rule, weigh the crown against the woman, and choose. The rule fired, and he stepped aside from the throne rather than from the relationship. He walked away from the institution, not from the person he loved. The consequence was devastating for the brother left behind. Albert, Duke of York, had not prepared to be king. He had a stammer that caused him genuine distress. He had not expected this responsibility and had not wanted it. Contemporary accounts confirm he felt deeply burdened and anguished by the abdication and what it had required of him. George VI spent much of his reign defined by his brother's choice, the man who stayed, who bore the burden Edward had put down, who held the thing together through the war years until his health gave out. He died in February 1952, aged 56, leaving 2 daughters and a wife and an institution he had served at considerable personal cost. His younger daughter, Margaret Rose, was 6 years old when her uncle abdicated. She grew up inside a family that had been reshaped by what the rule cost when it fired. She saw from childhood what the machinery did to the people it caught, and the machinery stayed in place, unchanged, waiting. Peter Townsend arrived in the royal household in 1944, when Margaret was 13 years old. George VI had been told that a handsome war hero had applied for the position of heir equerry. The description was accurate in every particular. Townsend had commanded No. 85 Squadron of the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain. To understand who he was, it helps to understand what that squadron did and what it cost. No. 85 Squadron flew during the critical months of 1940, when the Luftwaffe was attempting to destroy Fighter Command as a fighting force. The squadron flew out of Castle Camps and then Debden, in eastern England, night after night and day after day. On 3 February 1940, Townsend led the flight that shot down what was credited as the first German aircraft to crash on English soil during the war, a Heinkel HE-111 bomber, brought down over the North Sea and crashing on the Essex coast. Over the months that followed, he accumulated 9 to 11 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, along with shared kills and probable kills. He flew more than 300 operational sorties in total. 95 of them were at night, blind patrols through blacked-out skies, navigating by instruments, hunting aircraft he often couldn't see until he was almost on top of them. One British Legion biographical account states he led every patrol against the enemy except one during the Battle of Britain. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in April 1940, a bar to the DFC in September 1940, and the Distinguished Service Order in May 1941. In 2021, his medal group, the CVO, DSO, DFC, and Second Award Bar, alongside campaign medals, sold at auction at Dix Noonan Webb for £260,000. 11 medals, each representing something he had earned in the air over Britain during the worst summer England had seen in a generation. He wasn't a social climber. He wasn't a scandal. He was what the royal family had asked for when they advertised, a highly qualified man from the military, trusted, efficient, reliable. George VI reportedly regarded him with something like paternal feeling, the calm, effective war veteran, the son he had never had. Townsend was so frequently in the background of royal events that gossip columnists overlooked him as a potential suitor. He was simply part of the furniture of the household. He was also, in 1944, married to Rosemary Pauley, whom he had wed on 17 July 1941 in Much Haddam, Hertfordshire. They had 2 sons, the older named Giles and the younger Hugo. But the marriage wasn't well. From around 1950, accounts describe a breakdown. Townsend and his wife separated in 1951. In November 1952, he filed for divorce. The decree nisi was granted on 20 December 1952, on grounds of Rosemary's adultery with a man named John de Laszlo. Peter Townsend was the innocent party in the divorce, the wronged spouse, not the one who had broken the marriage vows. He obtained legal custody of his sons. Rosemary eventually remarried, first de Laszlo, and then, in 1978, Henry Pratt, 5th Marquis Camden, becoming the Marchioness Camden. She was alive in 1955. She was alive throughout everything that followed. Rosemary Pauley died on 27 February 2004. That fact, one woman's continued existence, was the precise mechanical trigger of the Church of England's prohibition. While she lived, Townsend was a divorced man with a living former spouse. While she lived, the rule applied. When Townsend first appeared in the household in 1944, Margaret was 13, and Elizabeth reportedly told her, "Bad luck, he's married." That remark, recorded in biographical accounts, captures the household's clarity about who he was and what he wasn't available to be. The romantic relationship between Margaret and Townsend didn't begin then. Multiple credible accounts place its development around 1951 and into 1952, when Margaret was 21 and 22. Townsend himself later said that his love for her began at Balmoral in the summer of 1951. The death of George VI in February 1952 accelerated something: the shared grief, the intimacy of the household at Clarence House, where Margaret had her own apartment, the fact that Townsend had been appointed comptroller of the Queen Mother's household after the king died. They were in close proximity at a moment of enormous loss, and what had been growing between them evidently deepened. In June 1952, the estranged Townsends hosted Margaret and other members of the royal family at a cocktail party. A month later, Rosemary and de Laszlo were seen together at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. The romantic relationship between Margaret and Townsend is thought to have crystallized around this period. American newspapers noted Margaret's increasing vitality in the months after her father's death, and speculated she must be in love. Margaret herself was celebrated and glamorous, and admired in ways that could obscure how seriously she held things. She attended parties. She was photographed at nightclubs and theater premieres, at balls and fashion events. The tabloids wrote about her constantly. Her circle of friends, the Margaret set, they were called, moved through the most fashionable drawing rooms in London. But she had also been confirmed into the Church of England in April 1946, and after her father's death, she was sometimes attending church twice daily. The faith wasn't performance, it was genuinely hers, which is part of what made what was coming so precisely cruel. The institution she was about to invoke against herself was one she had chosen on her own terms. On 2 June 1953, Queen Elizabeth II's coronation took place at Westminster Abbey. At a post-coronation gathering, Margaret was observed brushing a piece of lint or fluff from Townsend's jacket. It was an intimate gesture, casual in the way only closeness makes things casual. The kind of thing you do without thinking for someone you know well. A tabloid newspaper reporter noticed. The private relationship became a public story overnight. Press and government began openly discussing whether the Queen's sister intended to marry a divorced man. The machinery of the institution began to move. Townsend was posted as heir attaché to the British Embassy in Brussels that summer of 1953, a move widely understood as a managed exile, placing distance between him and Margaret while the question was weighed at the highest levels. He was sent away without ceremony, reassigned with the polite efficiency of an institution that knew how to make things disappear from the foreground without formally addressing them. Margaret waited. The press speculated. The government deliberated. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, any descendant of George II required the sovereign's consent to marry before the age of 25, failing which the marriage was void. But the act contained a provision for royals over 25. They could give 12 months' notice to the Privy Council, and if Parliament didn't expressly disapprove within that year, the marriage could proceed without requiring the sovereign's personal consent. Margaret turned 25 on 21st August 1955. A legal mechanism existed. A path, technically, was there. The reality had more walls. The Eden government made clear that Parliament wouldn't approve the marriage unless Margaret renounced her place in the line of succession. But archival material released from the National Archives around 2016 complicates the popular retelling. A plan drawn up in 1955 by Queen Elizabeth II and Prime Minister Anthony Eden proposed that Margaret could marry Townsend while retaining her royal title and her civil list allowance. The price was renouncing her succession rights. Margaret's own statement, issued on 31st October 1955, confirms the framework she had been presented with. She wrote that, "Subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage." The loss was real and significant. Succession rights, her position as a working senior royal, the full institutional weight of her status. But the popular version, that she would have lost everything, stripped of title and income, rendered a commoner, overstates the documented record. What was on the table was her place in the succession and the ambiguity of her public role that would follow from it. Still a serious cost for a woman who had never known any other identity, just not the total erasure the romantic retelling prefers. And even with all of that, the marriage could only ever have been a civil ceremony. Not because of the succession question, because of the church. The 1938 Convocation Resolution was absolute. The church wouldn't solemnize a marriage for anyone with a living former spouse. Townsend had a living former wife. No arrangement of succession rights, no political compromise, no archival plan drawn up by a prime minister could change that fact. The Church of England, which Margaret believed in, attended, had been confirmed into, cited privately and publicly as the source of her values, wouldn't stand at the altar for this marriage. The institution whose foundational act was an argument about the invalidity of a prior marriage would extend no version of that logic to cover Peter Townsend. In late October 1955, Townsend returned to England from Brussels on leave. He and Margaret met to decide. The accounts of what those weeks were like are fragmentary. A letter Margaret wrote to Prime Minister Eden in August 1955, released from government archives, showed she had been uncertain earlier that year. She wrote that she hoped to see Townsend in October to properly decide whether I can marry him or not, suggesting that her love, whatever its depth, had been complicated by months of distance and deliberation. Biographer Christopher Warwick, reviewing the letter, said it rewrites history. The certainty of the romantic telling, Margaret desperately in love, thwarted by an unfeeling institution, is softer than the record supports. She was uncertain. The decision was genuinely hers to make, which, in a way, is what made the institution's role both more and less forgivable. It didn't seize the choice from her. It shaped the terrain so severely that any choice came at catastrophic cost. Margaret visited Archbishop of Canterbury Geoffrey Fisher at Lambeth Palace at her own request in late October 1955, seeking guidance on whether to marry the divorced Group Captain Peter Townsend. Fisher had been archbishop since 1945. He was known, in the words of his biographers, for seeing one of his main tasks as making the Church's position on the marriage of divorced people widely understood and accepted. He had earlier that year called the press coverage of the romance a newspaper stunt. He wasn't a man who spent time wondering whether the rule was justified. He was a man who spent his 16 years as archbishop enforcing it and explaining it and making sure everyone understood it. The meeting at Lambeth Palace lasted approximately an hour. What was said inside it isn't fully recorded. Fisher later stated publicly that no pressure was used on Margaret. Whether that statement was accurate in spirit as well as letter is something the existing record can't resolve. What the record does show is that on 27 October 1955, Margaret told Fisher of her decision. His documented response was, "What a wonderful person the Holy Spirit is." Read that response and decide for yourself what it tells you about how the institution understood its role in what had just happened. Fisher wasn't being cruel. He appears to have been genuinely moved. He believed, sincerely, that Margaret had made the right decision through genuine religious conviction. That he could regard the outcome, a woman surrendering the person she loved, as evidence of the Holy Spirit's work tells you something about the distance between the institution's frame and the human experience inside it. 4 days later, on 31 October 1955, from Clarence House, Margaret issued her statement. "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." The statement said she had reached the decision entirely alone. It mentioned Townsend's unfailing support and devotion. The statement is worth sitting with for a moment simply as a piece of writing. It's careful and controlled and dignified. It names the Church directly, not the government, not the family, not public pressure. The Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble. It frames what Margaret is giving up as a civil ceremony, not a church wedding, because the Church would never have permitted a church wedding regardless. And it invokes her duty to the Commonwealth as if that had been the competing consideration, when the documentary record suggests the competing consideration was the Church's specific rule about Townsend's living former wife. Fisher subsequently told the press that no pressure had been exerted on Margaret. His New York Times obituary in September 1972 confirmed the framing the institution preferred. Princess Margaret, after consulting with the Archbishop, announced in 1955 that she wouldn't marry Group Captain Townsend because of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble. She had cited the Church. The Church confirmed it. The record shows a woman who believed in an institution and, when the institution's rule applied to her own life, honored it, or was shaped by it, or both. There is a question the audience for this story invariably arrives at, and it deserves a direct answer. The British royal family had been marrying cousins for generations, with the full blessing of church and state. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were first cousins, sharing their maternal grandfather, the Duke of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. They married on 10 February 1840. It was celebrated. No Archbishop of Canterbury called the union a theological problem. No convocation passed resolutions against it. It was treated as a model union, a match of genuine feeling within acceptable dynastic proximity, and the couple were enormously popular. The woman who was Margaret's own sister, Queen Elizabeth II, the supreme governor of the Church of England, was herself married to Prince Philip, with whom she shared ancestry as third cousins through Queen Victoria and as second cousins once removed through other lines. Their 1947 wedding at Westminster Abbey was celebrated as a moment of post-war joy. No ecclesiastical obstacle was raised on grounds of their shared descent. George V and Queen Mary were second cousins. Edward VII and Queen Alexandra were third cousins. The family tree of British royalty runs through several generations of deliberate consanguinity, each union officially sanctioned by the same church that was refusing to sanctify Margaret's. The Church of England maintains a formal document called the Table of Kindred and Affinity, the list of prohibited degrees of relationship for marriage purposes, based on Archbishop Matthew Parker's formulation in the 16th century. Cousins aren't on it. They never have been. Cousin marriage is canonically permitted under Anglican discipline. It has been legal in England since the 16th century, so the architecture of the rule becomes visible. The Church would sanction a marriage between first cousins, a biological connection that modern genetics and modern sensibility would regard as at least worth noting. But it wouldn't sanction the marriage of a woman to a man whose former wife had committed adultery against him, not because of any scriptural prohibition on the second category, but because of the 1938 Convocation resolutions on remarriage while a former spouse lives. The Church's defense, stated honestly, is that these are different canonical categories addressing different questions. The remarriage prohibition is grounded in Christ's explicit teaching on the permanence of sacramental union. The consanguinity rules address biological relationship. They operate in entirely separate theological registers. Bishops at the time were explicit that the remarriage prohibition was a genuine theological position, not institutional convenience dressed in Scripture. But consider what was also true. The rule was out of step with ordinary British life. Polling of the period suggested a majority of the public disagreed with the Church's position on the remarriage of divorced persons. And the institution that maintained it, the institution whose supreme governor was constitutionally required to embody it, was the same institution that expected the royal family to function as its living example. As one academic study of the period puts it, the sovereign and the royal family were expected to be the Church's living example. The family at the top of the institution was supposed to model what the institution taught, not because any individual bishop ordered it, but because the constitutional arrangement made it structurally inevitable. The supreme governor's family couldn't visibly depart from the supreme governor's church's teaching without the whole arrangement looking contradictory. Which is to say, the rule was enforced not purely because the theology would have collapsed without it, but because the church needed the monarchy to model it, and the monarchy needed the church to remain coherent as an institution. These were two establishments propping each other up, and Margaret was the woman standing at their intersection. A cousin could marry because cousin marriage didn't test the institutional arrangement. A divorcee's marriage did. Townsend understood the asymmetry without needing it explained. He later said, "I simply hadn't the weight, I knew it, to counterbalance all she would have lost." He was a Battle of Britain ace. He had 9 confirmed kills and 11 medals, and 300 operational sorties, and a record that bore scrutiny from any direction. He was the wronged party in his own divorce. His wife had committed adultery. He had not. None of that gave him institutional weight, because none of it changed the one fact that triggered the rule. Rosemary Pauley was still alive. Margaret went on with her life, in the way that phrase conceals everything about how a person continues after a decision that rearranges them. In February 1960, Clarence House announced her engagement to Anthony Armstrong Jones, a photographer of non-aristocratic background, whose world included artists and designers, and the more unconventional edges of London society. The wedding on 6 May 1960 at Westminster Abbey was noted as the first time in approximately 4 centuries that a king's daughter had married a commoner, a small revolution of its own kind, presented as modern and forward-looking. Armstrong Jones was made Earl of Snowdon in 1961. Neither party had a living former spouse. The Church of England stood at the altar this time. The full institutional sanction was present that had been structurally unavailable, whatever the other circumstances, in any version of a marriage to Townsend. They had 2 children, David, who became the 2nd Earl of Snowdon, and Lady Sarah, born in 1964. The early years were covered as a glamorous modern marriage, the couple photographed at parties and openings, Margaret in her element, Snowdon in his. But by the later 1960s and through the 1970s, the picture that emerges from accounts and biographies is of a marriage under severe private strain. Sordid gossip, extramarital affairs on both sides eventually confirmed. A domestic life that had become a performance of something it no longer contained. They separated in 1976 and divorced in 1978, the first dissolution of a senior royal marriage, according to historical accounts, since Henry VIII's annulment of his marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540. That comparison, reached by the historical record rather than the script, has its own sharp resonance. The Church of England was born from one royal marriage dispute. More than 4 centuries later, it was the backdrop to another. The institution that had blocked Margaret from marrying the man she chose in 1955 had watched the marriage it didn't block end in the same failure it had told her implicitly she must avoid. The irony is softer than it first appears, and that softness is worth being honest about. The Church's 1950s rule prohibited solemnizing a remarriage while a former spouse lived. It didn't and couldn't prevent a marriage from failing. Margaret didn't remarry after Snowdon. The Church never formally permitted her divorce in the sense of blessing a subsequent remarriage. What happened is more structurally bleak than a clean irony. The prohibition had defended the institution's doctrine in 1955. The marriage it didn't obstruct ended in failure anyway, and Margaret was left having surrendered Townsend for exactly nothing the rule was supposed to protect. She spent her later years known for moustique holidays and for the cigarette in the tortoiseshell holder that appears in account after account as a detail someone always remembers. She was funny and sharp and admired. She was also, by multiple accounts that agree across different sources, unhappy in ways she wore carefully. A woman who knew how to perform contentment so well that the performance became the public record, while the private record was something else. Craig Brown's biography describes her life in 99 glimpses that collectively build a portrait of a woman of genuine intelligence and charm, who never quite found the shape her life was supposed to take after October 1955. Townsend later said she had been reportedly plagued with a deep sadness over her choices. Whether that's the right word, plagued is a strong word. The record suggests that what she had given up wasn't something she stopped thinking about. Townsend died on 19 June 1995 in Rambouillet, France, aged 80. He had remarried in 1959, a Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Gemagne, and had children. He had written a memoir and lived a quiet life outside the public eye. He was 80 when he died, and the relationship that had defined a chapter of both their lives had ended on 31 October 1955 in a statement from Clarence House. Margaret died on 9 February 2002 at King Edward VII's Hospital, London, aged 71. She had suffered a series of strokes from 1998 onwards, each one taking something. The last one, in February 2002, was the one she didn't survive. She was buried at Windsor. Her ashes were later interred in the King George VI Memorial Chapel alongside her parents. In July 2002, 5 months after her death, the Church of England's General Synod voted to permit the remarriage in church of divorced persons in exceptional circumstances, by 269 votes to 83. The motion explicitly revoked the 1938 Convocation resolutions, the same resolutions that had formed the operative rule when Margaret issued her statement in 1955. The formal institutional change came 47 years after the decision that had defined her life. It came 5 months after she died. She had given up Townsend, citing the Church's teaching. The Church changed its teaching in 2002. She didn't live to see it. Rosemary Pauley, whose continued existence in 1955 had been the precise mechanical trigger of the prohibition, outlived all of it. She died on 27 February 2004. What should be said clearly, because it isn't usually said, the people on the other side of the 1955 decision weren't simply heartless. Geoffrey Fisher ran an institution with a genuine theological position, one he had spent his 16 years as Archbishop articulating and defending. He believed what he taught. The Church of England's teaching on marriage was held with sincerity by many who understood it as an expression of something Christ had said plainly. The politicians involved faced real constitutional constraints. Anthony Eden wasn't a villain in this story. Queen Elizabeth II was simultaneously Margaret's sister and the supreme governor of a church whose doctrine her own marriage was constitutionally required to exemplify. She couldn't, as supreme governor, sanction a church wedding the church itself forbade. She couldn't, as sovereign, approve a marriage Parliament would reject. The trap had multiple walls, and most of the people enforcing them believed in what they were doing. But the founding irony does not dissolve because the participants were sincere. The Church of England exists because a king built an institutional machinery to get an annulment that the universal church refused him. He made himself the judge of his own case. He appointed the archbishop who delivered the finding. He assembled the parliament that passed the legislation. He got the answer he wanted. And the institution built on that act then codified, in 1930, in 1938, in 1957, a doctrine on the permanence of marriage and the impermissibility of remarriage while a former spouse lives, a doctrine that the very act of the institution's founding had violated in every particular. Henry's wife was still alive when he remarried. Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle on 7 January 1536. She died 3 years after Cranmer's court had declared the marriage null, and 2.5 years after Anne Boleyn had been crowned. In Henry's construction, of course, Catherine had never been his valid wife. The annulment had declared the marriage never to have existed. He had always been free. That is the founding logic of the Church of England applied to its founder. The rule that blocked Townsend could never have blocked Henry, because Henry had built the institution that made the ruling, appointed the archbishop who delivered it, and declared himself, in law and constitutional arrangement, the supreme head of the church, whose teaching he had just violated. Townsend had no such mechanism. His marriage to Rosemary Paul was real and recognized, and had been dissolved through civil proceedings in which he was the wronged party. But Rosemary was alive in 1955, and so the rule applied. And so, Margaret went to Lambeth Palace at her own request and came back and wrote a statement that cited the church's teaching as the reason she was walking away from the one thing the record suggests she most clearly wanted. The institution eventually adapted. When a later generation of the royal family encountered its own marriage difficulties, relationships that had failed or never properly begun contracted under the same institutional pressure that made honest choices harder to make and public about it, the church found mechanisms. A civil ceremony here, a service of prayer and dedication there, a careful workaround that preserved the doctrine's public face while acknowledging the reality people were actually living. The Church of England permitted a senior royal to marry a divorcee in the early years of the 21st century through exactly this kind of managed accommodation. Not a church wedding in the traditional sense, but a civil ceremony followed by a blessing, and nobody calling it a contradiction. The machinery that had been absolute in 1955 turned out to be flexible when the institutional pressure was different, and the people involved were different, and the decades had moved. Whether anyone looked back at what had happened to Margaret and saw it clearly is a different question. The record of the decades between her decision and the Church's eventual policy change suggests the lesson wasn't absorbed cleanly, that the same institutional rigidity produced its own costs in other forms, that the family's long habit of performing a certain kind of respectable constancy came at prices that were paid by the people inside the performance. Margaret's sacrifice wasn't a sealed chapter. It was an early page in a longer account of what the institution asked of the people who embodied it. She paid the opening price. The institution took it and moved on. The church that England built to end one marriage was the same church that refused to let Margaret begin hers. Henry VIII needed an exit from a union that wasn't working, and built an institutional mechanism to provide it. He made himself the judge, appointed the archbishop, passed the legislation, declared the marriage void. 4 centuries of doctrine, ceremony, and episcopal authority grew from that act. And then, a woman who had grown up believing in that institution, confirmed into it as a teenager, and praying inside it twice a day while she mourned her father, was told by that institution that the man she loved was the wrong kind of divorced. Edward VIII had a crown. He could put it on the table and walk away from the rule, toward the woman. He chose love and gave up the throne. The institution enforced its position. He simply stepped outside its reach. Margaret had no crown of her own to trade. She had succession rights she was prepared to renounce. She had a title she might have retained. She had a faith she took seriously, in a church whose founding act was precisely the kind of marital rupture its own doctrine now forbade. The difference between the king who was freed and the princess who was broken was never scripture. It was who was holding the instrument of power when they made the ask, and who was simply on the receiving end of the answer. On 31 October 1955, Margaret issued her statement from Clarence House and became the woman who had done the right thing by an institution that had done a rather different thing when it suited it. She was 25 years old. She had vivid blue eyes and a sharp wit, and a faith she practiced seriously, and the rest of her life ahead of her, rearranged around an absence. She never married Peter Townsend. The church changed its rule in July 2002, the same year she died, 5 months after the fact. The former wife, whose continued existence had been the mechanical trigger of the prohibition, outlived all of it. Rosemary Paul died in February 2004, more than 2 years after Margaret was gone. The rule held for the years it needed to hold. Then it was changed when the institution decided it was ready. Margaret wasn't consulted about the timing. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe. There are more of them.